the last part of our test or our study guide here are going to be going through separation of powers, checks and balances, as well as a few questions about federal, unitary, confederal, and parliamentary systems. So let's go ahead and start out. This part is pretty much a review. We're just kind of looking at how the Constitution limits government power through the use of checks and balances and separation of powers. And I'll toss in federalism in there a little bit since that does limit the national government's power as well. So the first question we have here, and this by no means should be new, explain the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. So we have separation of powers is merely taking government power, what government's supposed to do, and dividing it into three separate parts, or just dividing it up. Normally when you see the words legislative, executive, and judicial, and it's taking that power and it's dividing it up into three, then that's all separation of powers is. However, and I need to add this, so I'm going to go do that real quick, and we're going to come. All right, now the last part of our study guide, the last part of our test is on benchmark 1.7, which is all about how the Constitution limits the power of government through checks and balances and separation of powers. This by no means is new information, so we're just kind of going to go through it pretty quickly. Since we know it, we just kind of have to talk about some big parts and kind of some application aspects of it. In addition to that, we're going to go ahead and toss in federal, unitary, confederal, and parliamentary questions just to kind of keep your mind fresh on those concepts as well. So first and foremost, we need to look at the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. And we know separation of powers pretty well, so I'm going to just kind of briefly go over that. It's taking government power and it's splitting it into different parts. We call those parts branches, and the three branches we have are legislative, executive, and judicial, and each branch does a specific job. So the legislative branch creates laws, the executive enforces those laws, and the judicial interprets or judges those laws. However, with checks and balances, it's taking those three branches and it's giving power to each one as a way to keep the other branches balanced or from gaining too much power. So checks and balances is when those branches of government limit the power of others, or when the branches are keeping each other in their proper places. So an example would this be Congress can override a presidential veto. The president, of course, can veto or reject a law. The Supreme Court can step in and determine something unconstitutional. Now, I don't think this is going to be on your test, but it is important to know and just kind of preview for the next unit. What does each branch of government do and what article is representing, or where can you find that information? So identify the main role of each branch of the United States government. So we have Article 1, which is the legislative branch, and they create laws. We have Article 2. Article is just a part of a document, by the way, so it's like an article. So if you're reading a newspaper article, you're reading a part of a newspaper. If you're reading an article in a document, you're reading a part of the document. Article 2 is about executive branch, and they enforce or carry out laws. And last but not least, we have judicial branch, and they interpret or judge laws, and we can find that in Article 3. So this Article 1, Congress, Article 2, President, Article 3, Supreme Court, and the court systems. Moving further down here, constitutional government is going to show up on your test. It's a very big, important concept. So just to define it, it's a government that is limited, empowered by a written constitution, and more so, the constitution or the government has to follow the constitution. So if the government or the constitution says that the government has to do something, the government has to do it. So if it says that the president has to make sure the laws are faithfully executed, he has to do it. If the Congress says, or the Constitution says Congress has to lay and collect taxes, well, that's what they have to do because that is a power of theirs, and only they are able to do it. So we're a constitutional government. We are limited in power by the Constitution. So here's an example. The president vetoing a bill, Congress overriding a presidential veto with 2/3 vote, and the Supreme Court declaring actions of the other two branches of government unconstitutional is kind of a key word when it comes to the Supreme Court. Would be an example of what? So since I gave you kind of a hint here, it's an example of keeping each other in their proper places. It should be an example of checks and balances because the branches of government are having powers and intertwining and limiting each other. Last but not least, we have federal, unitary, confederal, and parliamentary. Now, I kind of always remembered this with unitary being a single unit or one single unit and strong central government. Confederal is our too weak government, so it's the one that only gives power to the states. Federal, it's a good happy medium, it's that just right. And parliamentary is something that's kind of off on its own, doing its own little thing. So taking a look at the first set of questions here, which system of government is known for dividing power between the state and national? Now I know very well, I gave you a little chart here, and we're going to be doing this chart a little bit later on this year, but anytime you see a question asking you about dividing power up and an answer is not separation of powers, because it's not talking about the branches, it's just talking about dividing powers up in different levels, like national, state, local levels, it's going to be talking about federalism. Number 21 here, which system of government has a weak central government and a loose association of states? Now, loose association of independent states is kind of the key word here. Weak central government, that's of course going to be our confederal, where voters elect someone to a regional government, and then those regional governments tell the central government what to do. But all of the power here is in the regional or state and local governments. Number 22, it's asking about the strong or very strong central government, and it does not share power. Does not share power being the key part. Now, if it's a strong central government that forces others to do something, it's going to be a unitary. We had that question on our last test about how was King George and Parliament a unitary. It's because they forced the colonists to do certain things. And the last question we have on our study guide here is, how are the executives? Executive, by the way, is the leader of the executive branch. So most governments have an executive branch in some way, whether that be a president like we have in our presidential system. Some people have a monarchy, which would be like the king. Some people have a parliamentary system, and that'd be the prime minister. But they are all elected differently. So how are the executives elected differently in a presidential and parliamentary system? So if I have here, if I'm looking, parliamentary system, I know it's a little blurry, but it says citizens elect the legislature, which is called a parliament, and then from there, the parliament selects the executive, or also known as the prime minister. So in a presidential system, it's just citizens electing an executive and citizens electing the legislator. They elect both. Whereas in a parliamentary, citizens only elect the legislature, and then the legislature elects the prime minister. And that's kind of what we kind of see here. The presidential system is where people both elect the executive and legislature, whereas in a parliamentary, people only elect the legislature, and then that legislature selects the prime minister. All right, that's it. That's your study guide. I hope you guys learned something. Hope you study for your test on Friday. Good luck. I know you can get 100, an A, a B. I don't want to see a lot of C's this time around. Definitely no F's. No F's this time. Yes, please, no F's. Just C's and above. See you later.